Thank you very much. Senator Tuttle and Representative Cheney and colleagues of the Joint Standing Committee on Veterans and Legal Affairs. My name is Pat Flood. I'm a state senator from Senate District 21, southern portion of Kennebec County, and I live in Winthrop. I'm here to present to you today LD 239, an act to improve the return to the state on the sale of spirits and provide a source of payment to MAINS Hospital. I'm aware that you and the committee members have been through various briefings and presentations regarding this subject, so I'll do my best to avoid duplication. And I do want to present to you today, as the bill sponsor, a perspective from several years of work on this matter and offer comments of support and, more importantly, some comments of concerns. This bill now comes before you, before the full legislature. I thank you very much, the chairs of the committee, for this opportunity to do so. I'll be as brief as I can. First, I did want to answer the questions of some members of the legislature and my family said, why did Governor LePage choose you to sponsor this bill? And I said I thought it was very obvious. It's because the governor and I are so much alike. We're both very calm and quiet and easygoing and patient. I thought it was a perfect fit. In all due respect, I do thank him. I'll explain how that evolved, but I do wish him the best in his endeavor here. I want to state very clearly, initially, my strong support for the concept put forth in LD 239. The bill proposes to use revenues from a yet-to-be-negotiated 10-year contract, or a series of contracts, for the management of the state's liquor and spirit sales to fund debts to hospitals, necessary expenditures for river and groundwater protection, and replenishment of the state financial reserves. Uniquely, it proposes to borrow against a portion of the 10-year stream of revenues to make a large and somewhat final payment over hospitals, much of which has been discussed. As an appropriator for the last 7 years, and as the past chair of the Appropriations Committee, I know that this payment to hospitals is a very astute use of funds to meet an obligation and to eliminate further liabilities to our state, and I'd like to let me explain. Most of you on this committee, many veterans will recall that 2 years ago in our biennial budget deliberations, the single most important financial undertaking of that work was to find ways to reduce our unfunded actuarial liabilities inherent in our state pension system, and to simultaneously find ways to reduce the biennial normal costs of funding the pension system. This was very challenging work, not easy work, but it was necessary to eliminate this long-term burden and to reduce our biennial costs. For were we not to do that, we would have continued to harbor an unfunded liability of the pension system to all the people of Maine in the neighborhood of $4 billion and escalating biennial costs in the $900 million range. Unsustainable for sure, requiring action for sure, extremely contentious and difficult for sure, but we did our job. All 13 members of the committee agreed, and the full legislature came together and found ways to cut the unfunded liability by about half and reduce our biennial cost by about $300 million. These changes, as tough as they are permanent. And once we decided to boldly face them and to make those changes that you put into place are permanent. And as an appropriator, that's very, very important. It allows us to view our future very differently. This was a crucial financial step for our state. It indicated to our people that we could address long-term problems head-on, fix them in significant ways. It wasn't a perfect set of solutions, but they forever changed our long-term debt load and set us on a path of long-term security. And I thank the Appropriations Committee for that work and the legislature. We have the opportunity today to address the ever-present issue of hospital debt in the same manner of permanency. We would use a different fiscal approach, but it would have the same effect of permanency. And that may or may not be clear, so I want to explain that. First, I want you to be aware that in the same biennial budget and other supplemental budgets during the 2012-13 period, we've also forever changed the methodology in which we pay hospitals. Instead of continuing with the arduous several-year auditing process between the federal government and the state government, allowing debts to accrue and build up over several years before paying them, we changed the system to two new real-time methodologies called DRGs, which are diagnostic-related groupings, and APCs, ambulatory payment classifications. Now when we get bills from hospitals, with very few exceptions, they're paid almost immediately, no buildup of large debts. Those new processes are in effect actually now. So as we sit here today, contemplating the wise use of state funds, we know that when we pay this current $187 million debt of state funds to hospitals, it will largely be our final installment. No more buildup, In other words, we won't get into this mess again. That's why I'm so strongly in support of the governor's suggestion that we use these future liquor contract revenues to eliminate another one of our significant financial burdens. It will set us up for greater opportunities for fiscal success in the future. It's a bit like making that final payment on your home mortgage or making your last car payment. I wish to now explain to you how I became involved with this liquor contract process. In 2004 or 5, I don't actually know, we did sell a 10-year lease to the liquor business to a firm for approximately $125 million plus 10 years of profit sharing revenues. Much has been said about the wisdom of that contract, and my intent is not to comment on that today. That was then, this is now. That contract's about to expire, and in the spring of 2011, as chair of the Appropriations Committee, I knew that our committee and the legislature would struggle with the actual closing of that budget. I knew we were going to have difficult negotiations, and we would need some innovations to bring that into balance. In search of innovation, I worked with our fiscal office, Grant Benoyer, and our past commissioner of DATS, Brian Lowe, to understand the components and the values of the liquor contract, with the hope of somehow finding some resources from its next contract to help balance this difficult 2012-13 cycle. My idea crystallized into this. What if we required in year 13 a down payment of $40 million to close the remaining budget? And what if we required the administration to seek another 10-year liquor contract, and instead of one lump sum payment like the previous one, that these funds came to us over a 10-year period? And what if we dedicated some of those funds in the next 10 years to the Budget Stabilization Fund, the general fund, supporting of wastewater and safe drinking water systems, and to support highway maintenance? These were all areas of chronic underfunding during my years here at the State House. Perhaps this 10-year contract could be the vehicle to ensure better funding for the ensuing 10 years. I reviewed that concept with all the legislative committee leaders and presiding officers, the Appropriations Committee. They were all supportive and actually somewhat relieved that we had a way to close that budget. I then reviewed it with Governor LePage for his consideration as well. He was gracious in 2011 as listening to that concern, and he liked the 10-year flow of funds rather than a lump sum, but he asked, Pat, could we utilize only $20 million for a down payment from the prospective liquor contract to close the budget? With that understanding in mind, with the support of the legislative leaders in the Appropriations Committee, we made that our final amendment in the budget building process. We used $20 million to balance the budget, and we required that liquor and spirit proceeds going forward would flow over 10 years to the aforementioned accounts. And it left the contracting responsibilities appropriately to the Commissioner of the Department of Financial Services, Saul McMillan, and his staff. Now I wish to bring you up to the present day before I conclude. During this summer, like you, I heard that Governor LePage might wish to securitize some of the liquor revenues to pay hospital debt. In December, he and I met to discuss that process going forward. We agreed that my original concepts, using some of the liquor funds for support of water quality and highway maintenance, were important and wise uses of the revenue stream. We also agreed that using a significant portion of these funds to pay our last large hospital debt was also very important and wise use of liquor revenues. He explained his revenue bond idea to me, and I voiced my support. I thought it was a rock-solid method of putting the state on stronger fiscal stability. We shook hands, and I told him I would in fact like to sponsor this legislation, and that I hoped we could work on it together through the legislative process. Several weeks later, LD 239 was printed. It's now before you today. Others will speak to you today about the details of the contracting methodology in LD 239. I just want to state that I harbor no ill will whatsoever to the current contract holder. In fact, many in that circle of contract providers are valued constituents of mine. Yet I do believe that there is a wisdom in reviewing all the integral pieces of the value chain here in order to maximize values to the state, and I respect your review of that process. I'd like to make a couple of closing thoughts. My first question to the governor regarding his revenue bond concept was concerning the use of bonds to pay down current liabilities. I crossed this issue previously in the Appropriations Committee, and I know that question has surfaced in various venues since then, and it surfaced here again today with Senator Patrick's question. I discussed the same question with the Office of Fiscal and Program Review staff members and encouraged them to also discuss this further with the governor's staff. I know those meetings have taken place, and my sense is that with language changes, we can find a way to make this work correctly. Ultimately, Attorney General Mills certainly has a voice in that decision. Today, a revenue bond, from the standpoint of the marketers of bonds, is a highly valued product. After all, they bring with them a more or less guaranteed source of revenues to support the borrowing. And I would think that there would be no greater source of certainty than revenues generated from the sale of liquor and spirits going forward. Therefore, I believe that these bonds would be sold in a heartbeat, compare it against GO bonds, which today, although they carry the full pledge, full faith and credit from the municipality or state government, they're pledged by relatively low reserves. I've heard some people in this building suggest we try to negotiate the debt with our hospitals before agreeing to pay it down. I want to say that I'm not really sure I'm comfortable with that unless the hospitals came forward with such an overture. It's a genuine debt that we owe. Hospitals care for people, provided service, and help bring people back home to their families. The one valid question I think we might ask hospitals in this regard would be if they would want to help cover the cost of managing the bond. I expect that this revenue bonding process would carry a 2% tag, roughly $3.7 million. Perhaps they could participate in a portion of this. But then again, in fairness, they may have the perception that these payments are way past due, and they've been floating them for some time. I think we need to be fair to all parties and seek, I think, the best and most expedient process. I worry about the pace of LD 239 going forward. I know that a bill such as this, probably the largest bill we will deal with in this legislature, other than the budget bills, is going to have many interested parties. Of course, the process of going through your committee and the Appropriations Committee warrants steady review. Something this important is not likely to lend itself to shortcuts. But it's also somewhat urgent to try to release these funds to hospitals, so, as the governor mentioned to you, federal matching dollars can come forward. And I believe the governor is correct in stating that when upwards of, I say 500, I think he's saying 700 million more accurately, is placed back into the economy, good things will happen. And finally, I think we legislators need to stay calm and thoughtful as we guide this bill through the process. My biggest concern is that we'll allow other things to get in the way of that. Yes, this bill's important. Yes, it involves a huge amount of money. But it is vital to have our leaders and our committees in this building all working in alignment on this really important item. It's too important and too big to mess up. I know that this committee is extremely knowledgeable, very capable, and will add greatly to this legislative review, and I thank you for that. I promise to do my best as a bill sponsor to help this bill find a reasonable path through the legislative process to completion. I appreciate your consideration of the bill. I know your partners at the Appropriations Committee will do their share too. Working together, I'm sure we can find the best possible result here, and I thank you very much for your consideration. I wish you the best. Hope you will contact me if you think I can help. Thank you very, very much.
Are there any questions of Senator Flood, Representative?
Russell.
Yes, Russell.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm very hard to remember, apparently. Senator Flood, thank you for being here and thank you for presenting this bill. I have just a couple of quick questions regarding the $20 million. Recently, a letter went to the governor with an initial offer from the current contract holder, and there was this interesting little phrase in there under helpful suggestions as to why we should continue to move path forward, and it said other legal challenges or something along those lines. And my question is there a concern around the $20 million that you put down that as a contract from 2 years ago, that there could be some way that could cause some hitches going forward? Because I mean, I have to also say, as the former chair, that this did not ever come back to our committee, and a decision was made through the appropriations process to sort of move forward with however you were choosing to, and the policy question didn't come back. So I'm pleased to see that it did come back this year, and that we're slowing the process down to look at the best value for Maine. But if you could talk to the $20 million and how that's going to work, that would be great.
The $20 million is no longer in effect. That was a vehicle that we used to pass the biennial budget of 2012-13, the one we're currently in. We did that in year 2011. That was, as I said, the final amendment to get us through a challenging period. The budget that we just passed, the supplemental budget, eliminated that provision.
And there was no contract relationship at that point?
No.
Okay.
Because we hadn't gone forward with actually doing it. The language that was in the budget bill referred to taking some actions in June of 2013. So
okay. Excellent. Thank you for clarifying that.
Senator Patrick.
Thank you very much, Senator Chairman Tuttle. Senator Flood, and I want to thank you for your presentation, because you encompassed a lot of things that have been on my mind for a long time, and you have had knowledge as chair of the Appropriations Committee, and have worked on some of the most difficult issues that the state of Maine has faced. And that being said, within your testimony, you brought up about the unfunded actuarial liabilities. And one of the things that I'm looking at from my standpoint is looking at the debt that is owed to the hospital in relationship to the unfunded actuarial liabilities. Because when I looked at that 2 years ago, when I had to make my tough decision, I as a working man have always looked at it from the standpoint of when you have debt, you take a look at what does one derive from his wages or his contract with his employer, and which is I call deferred wages, which basically make up his hourly wage, his health care, maybe his A&S insurance, and his pension, that a person who works 40 hours gets X amount of dollars. Part of what he gets by working for that employer goes as a moral obligation that when that person retires, therefore, the expectation is that that employer, whether it be a paper mill or whether it be the state of Maine, has a moral obligation to pay to that employee something that he has already paid for, which would be the pension. Right. So my question would be basically is kind of, what is the difference between the debt owed to the hospitals and the debt that was owed to paying back the monies promised for retired state workers and teachers? Is there a difference between the two as far as a moral obligation?
The moral obligation to the pensioners was upheld. I want to be sure you understand that. There was no pensioner that lost anything in their pension. The state pension, the people who receive state pensions continue to receive state pension. What we did, and again, these were unanimous decisions of the committee, we pulled down some of the potentialities going forward on cost of living adjustments primarily. And the cost of living for many years had been 1%, 1.5%, less than 1%. The fact of the matter is, Senator Patrick, that the wording in our pension system at the time said, from an actuarial standpoint, up to 4% could be paid on a cost of living adjustment. The fact that we hadn't given any up at that rate was becoming obvious that the simple fact that the language stated you could give up to a 4% increase in a retirement pension made it incumbent upon the pension system in the state of Maine to fund fully the 4%, even though we hadn't given a 4% increased cost of living for many years. So we simply changed the language. It was a very powerful change in language where we said up to 3%. That brought down, that simple tone, that simple change brought down the actuarial liability significantly. And were none of us not briefed and informed for weeks and weeks from the pension system and from the actuaries, we wouldn't have understood the complexity and actually the relative simplicity of making that step to make that huge change. So going forward, we put brakes on the cost of living adjustments, put them for the past 2 years and the next year at the Consumer Price Index cost of living, and on a $20,000 basis. So we maintain that obligation. The obligation to the hospitals is one that I think is more current. It's just like a flowing 3-year, it has a kind of a 3 or 4 year flowing obligation. And I think that because of the DRGs and APCs that we've implemented with the hospital payment system, that debt buildup will not come back. So once the significant difference here is this is an obligation that is a short term. It's an obligation that's going to, once eradicated, not likely to come back in at least those huge amounts going forward.
Yes, Mr. Patrick, $5.
I'd also like to kind of look at the different things that are going to receive funding through the bill, and the water treatment, and there was like 2 or 3 roads and bridges and stuff. this, to me, although they're great ideas, almost kind of reminds me of kind of bundling them like happened in the Casino Cascades. And I think they're great ideas, and I can't say I disagree with any of them, but knowing, as someone on the appropriations, and knowing the need for actual dollars to run the state, was it some special thought given to putting it into these versus putting the excess money into the general fund?
It was, the special thought was given in 2011 when we initially passed that language, and it carried forward into this bill. And it's up to the legislature how they want to use dollars, up to the appropriations committee how they want to use dollars. Those particular functions, the wastewater treatment facilities, the highway functions, those were both, the appropriations committee felt in 2011, those were areas where they felt very strongly we should go ahead with that. And then we also had, I think, 30% of the money flowing to the stabilization fund, 25 to 30% of the money flowing to the general fund, and the remainder was going to wastewater treatment facilities and the highway maintenance fund. Both of which we had just heard repeatedly since having been here that they were underfunded and unfunded or underfunded. So that is just simply a carry forward from the bill of 2011.
Senator Mason and Representative Bob after that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senator Flood, good to see you, sir. You talked about in your testimony that during the last biennial budget, the future and going forward with the state pension system, and how you had to look down the road to see if that was going to be a huge problem if you didn't make the adjustments that you were just talking about, that could have been, that would have hung over the head of the state for a long time. My first question has two parts. What, as an appropriator, you've been on the appropriations committee for what, 2 terms now? 4 years?
8 years.
8 years.
Going on 8 years.
This hospital debt is accrued from 2009. If we were to pay it, if we would have paid it right on time back then, do you think that the state could have saved a lot of money and we wouldn't have had to have paid as much as we are right now?
I don't know that to be the case. The system, again, I know just enough to be dangerous on the system. The state has to audit main care bills from the hospitals, and they send that to the federal government. They have to audit it. The process is just a long process, so it takes a long period of time. On the real actionable step that we took in 2011 to address that was changing that system to what I referred to before as DRGs and APCs. Those are both for inpatient and outpatient services. So when we made that change, that was, I think, the benchmark moment, because now we know going forward, with the exception, I think some of the critical access hospital payments still have a process we have to go through that's going to be a little bit lengthy. But I think once we made the DRG and APC process in statute, that eliminated the burden, the likelihood of a burden like this.